Now we're recording. Well, welcome everyone to tonight's discussion about reducing Helena's waste. I'm Diana Hammer and I'm representing Resilient Helena. We're a group that formed a couple of years ago with the intent of elevating the discussion around climate change and resiliency in Helena. And tonight's discussion is one of those events that Resilient Helena has been hosting over the past couple of years. And so Anne Brodsky and Denise Roth-Barber deserve the credit for organizing this meeting. They're the co-chairs of the Waste Committee of Helena's Citizens Conservation Board. And so I will turn it over to Denise to describe tonight's meeting.
Great. Well, thank you, Diana. So we're very pleased to have Lee Ratterman come and talk to us. Lee is the Zero Waste Systems Manager for the City of Missoula, or for the Home Resources City of Missoula. So she's here to talk to us about, kind of what they're doing, because the City of Helena actually has a 90% by 2050 zero waste goal that they're in the middle of implementing and reaching for. So we're very excited that we have a city just down the road leading the way. We're going to get started super quick, but before we do, I just wanted to ask people throughout this, as you hear things that might spark your interest in doing something with, please put that down in the chat box, because honestly, our biggest obstacle to making big advances right now is a shortage of actual people on the ground who are able and willing to spend some time on this. So we're not really short on great ideas, although we're always welcoming them. But if we don't have people to implement them, then we can't do them. So, for example, if somebody's interested in reaching out and talking to restaurants and finding out what they're doing to reduce their food waste and to recycle and find out why they're using paper products versus glass versus regular plates, just basically interview restaurants around the community to find out what they can and can't do right now with regards to reducing their own waste stream, or visiting the schools. Or if you're kind of an introvert, but you're really good on the computer, we don't have a really good website. In fact, we don't have a website. We just have a Zero Waste Helena Facebook group, which you're more than welcome to join. It's called Zero Waste Helena. And we'd love for you to join that as well. But if somebody has a knack for a good website, we would love for help with that. So there's a lot of different ways that people can contribute their time to, if interested, and you could commit, low, medium, high level of commitment. So throughout this, if you can just put in the chat box anything that comes up that, that you're interested in helping with, then we'll get in touch with you. So without further ado, I am pleased to present or introduce Lee Ratterman and welcome her to our meeting tonight. Take it away, Lee.
Awesome, thank you. Hello, everybody. So as they mentioned, my name is Lee Ratterman. I work at Home Resource here in Missoula, and my title is Zero Waste Systems Manager, which is a fancy way of saying that I'm responsible for looking at all of the systems and infrastructure and policy that exists in Missoula and what we need to get to our goal of zero waste by 2050. My position is funded by the city of Missoula, but it's kind of funneled through Home Resource through a community organization benefit grant, which is basically the city of Missoula has a pot of money that they push out to nonprofits to help support positions like mine. We're pretty lucky to have a very supportive city council, and we have lots of cool opportunities here in Missoula for zero waste. We have lots of room for improvement. So this presentation is one that I created to share kind of community-wide and statewide, and to whoever wants to hear it. And what I'm going to be kind of expressing is what we currently have in Missoula, what would help to get us down the road further for zero waste, and kind of our immediate next steps that we're planning on working and presenting to City Council to help with that mission. I also just want to apologize. Every single time I get on Zoom, my dogs start wrestling way across the room, and so you might hear that. And I can never stop them. It's just an embarrassing part of life now. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and get started. I think we're going to kind of hold off on questions. There will be a couple screens where I will pause. And if you have any questions at that point, you can go ahead, but otherwise maybe we'll hold them till the end if you can, and go that way. So I am just going to share my screen. Hopefully you all can see that. Awesome, thumbs up, thank you. Okay, so this presentation was originally created because we started last year, right in the middle of the pandemic. I was kind of tasked with starting a zero waste infrastructure task force. And so this is a group of people who are meant to kind of make recommendations and advise my position, Home Resource, and then also the city and county on zero waste needs, kind of specific to the infrastructure piece, but also recognizing that with infrastructure, we need policy, we need education, we need incentives, all of those sorts of things. So this task force is voluntary. It's made up of, we have a couple city council members. We have a representative from the Missoula Redevelopment Agency. We have city staff. We have some interested citizens. We have somebody from Climate Smart Missoula. We're looking to grow it probably to around 10 people or so, I think is a good size for an advisory group like this. But this group, they're not experts on zero waste. They're just kind of influential people who can help further the cause once they kind of garner support and we make decisions on where we want to go. These are the people that can really help us get to where we need to be going. So this is just a quick outline of zero waste, the Zero Waste International Alliance. I'll give you a second to read their definition of zero waste. And really what this definition is describing is a circular economy. And so zero waste is not just about keeping things out of the landfill anymore. For a long time, I've been in this industry for about 12 years now. And for a long time at the beginning of my career, it was always about recycling and composting. How do we get things out of the landfill on the back end? And now it's a lot more looking at things like reducing waste in the first place, designing materials so they don't go directly to the landfill, so they're able to be repaired and reused in our society, and changing culture and changing mindset and all of those pieces before something would ever make it to the bin to have to be recycled or composted. This is a very, very big picture overview of kind of what a zero waste Missoula would look like. And the point here is that you can take educated people, you can add policy and incentives, you can add infrastructure and end markets, but it doesn't ever stop. Every time you add something in, you kind of have to go back to the beginning and then educate people on how to use those new infrastructure and end markets, and then design policy and incentives to do that. And so there isn't really any sort of linear progression that makes sense in zero waste. That's kind of all at once. You can bite off chunks and take some low-hanging fruit, and those are really great things to do, but you always have to recognize that it's part of this larger system, and that, you know, you can't just add in a compost facility without training people how to use it and incentivizing them or requiring them to do it, and then finding an end market for that finished compost product. So it's just this continuous circle. So I kind of want to give a big picture of materials that are discarded in the municipal waste stream. So this is a national snapshot from the EPA of our waste. The first graph, or the first pie chart on the left, is our municipal solid waste that goes to the landfill. So you can see that 23% of the materials in the US going to the landfill are paper and paperboard. including cardboard. And you can see that if you add up all of the organic material, food, yard trimmings, wood, that equals about 40% of our waste stream in the United States going to the landfill. You can see that most of these materials do not need to go to the landfill. Most of these materials could be diverted if those from the previous slide, if all of those things existed in every community, we would not need to be sending the majority of these materials to the landfill. The kind of accepted definition of a zero waste landfill or zero waste materials is that we can divert about 90% of materials from the landfill. There's about 10% of materials that we make that just, there's nothing you can do with it. Moving over to the middle slide is what recycling looks like nationally. I'm sorry, I just have to keep moving things around. See my whole screen, but it kind of gives the amount of tons at the top. So you see 294 million tons of material that we throw away on the left. In the middle, which is the one I can't see because the bar is in the way, but that's the amount of material that we are recycling currently as a nation. And then the chart all the way to the right, 42.6 million tons is what we are diverting from the landfill in terms of organic material. We'll get into each of these materials separately as we go through the presentations. I'm not going to spend too much time except just to notice that there's a lot of paper going to the landfill. There's also a lot of paper being recycled. The organic side is pretty interesting. In terms of composting, as a nation, we're not really doing a great job of composting our food, but we are of our yard trimmings. And then I'll kind of define what those other management pathways looks like in a few slides, but we're doing a pretty good job actually of getting our organic material out of the landfill. So I think nationally we're at about a 35% diversion from the landfill. So we are not throwing away 35% of our materials on average. So here's just one local example. So I worked for many years in Boulder County, Colorado, which was a really great job. It was very different from working in Missoula. There was unlimited political support, unlimited funding in Boulder County. We could do anything we wanted. I would just walk into the commissioner's office and say, we need to do this, and they would sign the papers. And it was a much different experience than working here in Missoula, where there's not a lot of local rule, there's not a lot of funding. It's a lot more grassroots efforts like you guys are doing in Helena. But here's a snapshot of Boulder County, and I just wanted to put this here so that you can see it's pretty similar to the national snapshot. So this is what's going into the landfill. Still, you have about 20% paper. You have a little less organic material because they have a really robust composting program, but 14% construction materials. Problem materials is interesting. That actually makes up a lot of that percentage is made up of marijuana waste, since marijuana is legal in Colorado. They have really, really strict laws. You actually cannot compost or recycle any marijuana waste. It has to go to the landfill in a locked dumpster, in a locked truck. So however you feel about that issue, it's something that's significantly added to the landfill waste. Okay. So this is kind of specific a little bit to Montana. Montana, we don't have great data, and you're going to hear me say that a lot. Specifically Missoula, we do not have great data. And so we really actually don't even know where we're at on that road to zero waste. We don't know. Yeah, percentage-wise, we're not sure where we're at because we don't require data collection. Montana does require data from annual license renewal at facilities. So any landfill, transfer station, compost facility, they have to report data as they get their license renewal. But depending on what website you see, you're going to see very different numbers. And so I really would think that these are not incredibly accurate numbers that come off of the state of Montana website. But they are reporting that as of 2018, we were diverting 20% of our materials, which is lower than that 34%. Sorry, that was 2016. But we have about 1.8 million tons of waste going to the landfill in the state of Montana. that's a lot. We have good opportunity to divert some of that. So one thing I like to point out, specifically in the recycling world, is that this is a commodities market. And so these materials have a value on the market. And that really determines how recyclable those materials are. And so, you know, we've seen a huge decline in plastic recycling nationwide because the commodity market tanked. China decided they didn't really want to take all of our plastic crap anymore. And so they stopped that, and we have nowhere to recycle 3 through 7 plastic these days. I just wanted to share this, and I'm going to pause for a minute and let you all look at this chart of basically the commodities market of recyclable materials from 1990 to 2018. And it's really interesting because you can see it fluctuates a lot. And I kind of put the definitions of what those materials are to the left. I circled the highest value. You'll see in 1995, there was a surge for a lot of materials, and that was a really interesting year because there was basically economists said recyclables were going to be really, really valuable in 1995, and so they became really valuable in 1995, but that didn't really hold. And so it's just a really interesting example of the fact that it is a market and is subject to the whims of market as well. And so in 1995, everybody predicted that recycling was going to just be this huge thing and it was going to be so valuable. And so the markets went up and then tanked pretty quickly. But I'll stop talking for a minute so you can kind of look at the different values. So just a couple of things to point out. Recycling kind of was rising and rising and rising. And then when single stream recycling happened, the markets tended to either kind of tank or they stayed very steady, because when we used to separate materials and collect them just as their material, they were much higher quality because they weren't contaminated with other things. Like if you think about the bin of paper that was collected as paper and recycled as paper, it's going to be much cleaner and higher value than a bin that's collected with cans and bottles and paper all mixed together. And the recycling facilities have had to create all kinds of systems to then separate those materials, and there's a lot of contamination that have affected markets. Glass never really did anything, unfortunately. That's a really hard material to recycle. Plastics number 1 and 2 are pretty valuable. The other plastics are not at all. In fact, now it's cheaper to buy virgin plastic than it is to buy recycled plastic resin. So there's a real negative in terms of recycling those materials. Aluminum and steel generally have pretty good values. But yeah, it fluctuates. And so it's really hard to run a recycling company unless you're subsidized by city funding, unless you're subsidized by pickup costs, and if you have local end markets versus having to send them all over the world for recycling. Everything makes a difference in terms of the availability and success of recycling. So as I mentioned, I'm going to kind of go through pretty quickly the different materials, kind of starting with the biggest piece of the pie and then working my way down. I'm going to go through this quickly because there are a lot of materials and I don't want to take up your whole night. And so this is kind of a look at Missoula specifically and just give you some insight into what's happening here. So starting with organic waste, that was kind of 40% of that pie. And so this chart, again, is a national look at what is happening with these materials. So on the left is yard trimmings, on the right is food waste. Gray means landfilling. The blue is combustion with energy recovery, so essentially burning those materials. And then yellow is composting. So you can see, as that pie chart showed earlier, we are doing a pretty good job on yard trimmings. A lot of yard trimmings are finding their way into a compost pile, and not too much is being landfilled. Food waste, we have a long way to go. There's a large amount of food waste that is going into the landfill. So that other food management is kind of referring to this food recovery hierarchy that the EPA has put out. And hopefully you've seen something like this, but essentially it's kind of recommending things to do with food waste. And a lot of times we focus a lot on composting, specifically here in Missoula, because we have a city-owned compost facility. But there are so many better, more higher value things you could do with food waste, such as not making food waste, feeding hungry people, feeding animals. Industrial uses in this case means kind of distilling it down into oil or energy recovery, composting, and then lastly would be landfill and incineration. Again, it's a problem because it's 40% of our total waste stream. And as you probably know, when organic materials go into the landfill, they create methane, which is a huge problem in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. And by composting those materials, by reducing them first, but ultimately by composting those materials, we have the opportunity to 100% cure the methane from the landfill issue by keeping those materials out of the landfill and instead making them into a viable soil amendment. So here in Missoula, like I said, we're really lucky because we have a municipally owned compost facility. We think that's pretty rare for any municipality to have. A lot of times it's a really small grassroots efforts that pop up around compost and food waste collection, or things have to kind of get shipped or trucked far off to be composted. So we feel really lucky. Because of that, we, as Home Resource and in this effort, are not focusing hugely on compost beyond the education piece. And so this is, I'm going to have this chart for each of these materials, but basically for every material we look at, what do we have for access? What do we have for infrastructure? What do we have for policy? What do we have for education? And then what are the opportunities we could have going forward? Access, we have access, but it costs money. So even if you bring your compost to the compost facility, you have to pay a drop-off fee. So we do need to do a better job of providing incentives or making sure that low income and different populations, that everybody can access compost if they want to. Infrastructure, again, we have it. We have Republic offers curbside compost collection. We have a couple of other small organizations who offer home curbside compost collection. Republic also offers collection from businesses. Again, it costs money, but we could always have additional drop-offs. We have a nonprofit in town called Soil Cycle who's working on neighborhood compost collection sites. And so somebody would pay in a small fee and could drop off their compost right in their neighborhood. And then they would go around and pick it up regularly. So policy, you're going to see a lot of recommendation on policy called pay as you throw. And the broadest way I can describe that is basically it's a system where the more you throw away in trash, the more you send to the landfill, the more money you pay. And that higher cost offsets the cost of recycling and composting. So in a pay as you throw model, you can compost and recycle for free, both curbside, residential and business, but you pay for your trash. And so you pay significantly, and the more trash you make, the more you're going to pay for it. Other policies would be requiring. So when I worked in the city of Boulder, Colorado, we did the Universal Zero Waste Ordinance that required all people and businesses to both recycle and compost their materials. And then long-term would be like an organics landfill ban, which we don't actually have municipal control over the landfill. So that would be a really long-term goal because we would have to have the city of Missoula purchase the landfill in order to ban those any sort of materials. And then of course there's education. There's always people who are resistant because they don't know why they should do it. They don't know how they should do it. They don't know where the opportunities are to do it. And so we really have a long road ahead of making sure all of that education is in place. So very broadly, the kind of things that we recommend in terms of organics for the city of Missoula is to focus on reduction of food waste and yard waste through education. We have the infrastructure, we have the compost facility, and so it's really all of those other pieces need to be ramped up to help keep those materials from the landfill. Okay, so the next piece of the pie was paper. So here's that national snapshot on paper again. So we are throwing away a significant amount, but we are recycling more nationally than we are throwing away, and we're burning some paper too, unfortunately. So paper is highly recyclable. Cardboard can be recycled up to 7 times. It's usually the last iteration is toilet paper. So it goes from cardboard to paperboard to cardstock to office paper and so on and so forth until it becomes toilet paper. Here locally, we collect, or Republic Services collects paper in the single stream recycling. They bale it up and then they send it to their MRF, which is a materials recovery facility out in Tacoma, Washington, where it's then source separated and then sold off to market. So here in Missoula, we feel that people have opportunities to recycle paper. There's, they can pay for it at Curbside, or their business can pay for pickup. There's also free drop-offs throughout the city. Again, here's this chart. And a lot of these are going to be pretty redundant because a lot of it is just, we have to help offset costs. We need additional drop-off locations. Potentially the city could start its own materials recovery facility, so we're not having to bail up those materials and send them off to Tacoma, Washington. Again, there's the pay-as-you-throw model, which would help get more materials in the bin if people aren't having to pay for their pickup and they are having to pay to throw it away. The requirement piece, the landfill ban, and then more education. So again, in a nutshell, on paper, our recommendations for the city of Missoula are education is key. There's so many times, I don't know how many of you walk around your city and look in the dumpsters, but that's one of my favorite Friday night things to do. It is so frustrating when you see a trash dumpster and a recycling dumpster, and you look in and all of the cardboard is in the trash. Like it was there. They just had to put it right next to it and they chose not to. And so I think there's a lot of education around this is why you should do it. Access to ensure that all residents can recycle, and then policies to kind of catch those people who aren't willing to do it and tell them that they have to. So construction waste is significant as well. I think this is probably happening in Helena too. This isn't a Missoula thing, but houses and buildings are coming down at a rapid rate, and new construction is happening all over the place. Even in my neighborhood, I've lived here since June, and 3 houses in my little neighborhood have been demolished, sent to the landfill, and then these new giant corrugated metal condos have been built in their place. It accounts for a significant amount of materials going to the landfill. So this top chart is by weight, what the material makeup of construction waste looks like. So again, I specified by weight because it could be a little different if you're talking by volume, but generally concrete and asphalt are the huge pieces when we're talking about construction waste. And then that bottom chart I thought was very interesting because a lot of times we focus on, especially at Home Resource, because we are a buildings material reuse center, we want all of those materials from during construction. So we really ask that people deconstruct buildings rather than demolish them for those saving of the materials, and then focus a lot on job site recycling and those sorts of things. But really during construction is not when the waste happens. That's 33 million tons out of a total of 600 million tons. Really it's in that demolition process. So when a building is demolished and they just load it all into one giant dumpster and then send it to the landfill, that's where all of those materials are coming from. So in the city of Missoula, we're really trying to focus on figuring out how to incentivize and or require that contractors deconstruct buildings rather than demolish them, because this is a significant amount of waste. And it's really hard to see these good materials going into the landfill. So on a national average, it's about 12% of the total waste stream. These materials are generally inert in the landfill, so they're not emitting greenhouse gases once they're in the landfill, but they do make up a huge and significant amount because they're so big that they really kind of fill up the landfills quickly. But the problem is that when they are made, so when concrete is made, it's very carbon intensive and very environmentally damaging to create these materials. And so we want to keep them in the stream so we're not having to use so many resources to make them in the first place. We are pretty lucky again here in Missoula because deconstruction is sort of popular and hopefully growing in popularity. We have 3 companies that focus on deconstruction, and then they kind of salvage the materials and are able to sell and reuse those. And so we have multiple opportunities, including Home Resource that I work for, and the Habitat for Humanity Restore, which I know that Helena has as well. Those are opportunities to donate building materials and keep those out of the landfill. We also have a company that accepts asphalt and concrete for recycling. They have a huge machine that can handle concrete with rebar or any sort of material, and it just grinds it up, and then they're able to sell it or reuse it in projects that they do. So here's that chart again. This one is much more filled out, and I'm not going to really go over everything because it's a lot, but this is one, given that I work for Home Resource, that we have spent a lot of time on. We are running into some roadblocks around the policy piece because it's very hard in Missoula to create building codes that are local. It has to happen on a state level. And so a lot of our energy is focused on the education piece, really trying to encourage and create training and education programs for contractors and architects and all the different pieces of the building industry to train them on why and how and those sorts of things. We do have some local policy. So if it's a city funded project, it has to be deconstructed rather than demolished, but there's some room there because there isn't any sort of requirement around reusing those materials after, just that it has to be deconstructed, and there's not a lot of oversight on that program. And so we have a lot of room for opportunity, but we also have a lot in the existing category as well. So I think that we're pretty lucky in our community. So that big picture piece is that we do have many services and opportunities. Policy would be great if we could make it happen, and we're kind of exploring what a policy would look like that could be legal for our local elected officials to work on. And then education and incentive. Kind of the same story with a lot of these materials, but hopefully this is still interesting. Single-use plastic is another big one. So you can see that we are really not doing a great job nationally of recycling our single-use plastic. We're burning more of it than we're recycling, and we're landfilling way more than that. Plastic makes up about 12% of the total waste stream, and of that, only 4% is recycled. And so, as we all know, plastic is really invasive in our culture. It's prevalent, it's everywhere. There aren't many national markets for plastics. Plastics 1 and 2 generally are pretty valuable, as you saw in that commodities chart. But plastics 3 through 7 are so toxic and so low in value that not many people here have been able to figure out how to make a living accepting and recycling those materials. As I mentioned too, the virgin plastic is often less expensive than recycled plastic thanks to subsidies and low oil prices. So here in Missoula, we can recycle plastic 1 and 2, but we don't have an opportunity to recycle 3 through 7. During my presentation here, we actually called out the city of Helena for your ability to recycle as well, plastics. So yeah, there's not a ton of opportunity in terms of plastics recycling because, or it's, I guess there is opportunity, but we're not really focused so much on it because we just want to stop the plastic use. We want to encourage people to stop using single-use plastic. Of course, there are some plastics that are necessary in our world. There's healthcare healthcare and industrial uses and all of those sorts of things. But when we're talking about the single-use plastic, we would rather encourage people to reuse and reduce rather than focusing any energy on increasing opportunities to recycle plastic. Hopefully that makes sense. Metal is a highly recyclable material. So this chart is just aluminum. So your aluminum cans, which are so recyclable nationwide that it's really depressing to see how much of this material is going into the landfill and being burned, and not too much being recycled. So aluminum makes up, or metal in general, makes up about 8% of the total waste stream, and of that, 12% is recycled. It's a real shame because aluminum and steel are recyclable indefinitely. As long as we keep them in the market, they can just be recycled forever. And they're incredibly resource intensive to create. So just the story of an aluminum can, currently we're going all the way to Australia to clear cut and mine for ore. The ore that we take from Australia, we're then sending to Iceland, which is the biggest manufacturer of aluminum for some reason. So the ore is going from Australia to Iceland, made into aluminum, and then sent to the US here to kind of shape and create that can. If you drink that Coke or whatever you're drinking out of the can and then throw it away, we have to do that whole process all over again, where we're traveling the world and stripping the earth of its resources and all of that stuff. Whereas if you just recycle it, we can keep it in the bin forever. And so it's a really important material. All metal is, but aluminum and steel in particular. So here in Missoula, it's similar to the paper story where it gets accepted in the single stream recycling bin, baled up and sent to Tacoma, Washington for recycling. We also have some really great opportunities to recycle other types of metal. So metal that can't go in your food grade bin. We have Pacific Steel, we have Axemen, who actually will pay you for metal. If you bring them cans, they'll even pay you for the weight in cans. And there's no excuse to throw away metal in Missoula. And so it's not an infrastructure issue. Again, it's an education issue. If people aren't recycling their metal, especially since you can actually get paid for it, it's because they're not bought in or they don't know how. But here are some additional opportunities as well, which are very similar to the other ones. Okay, so I'm going to move on. I guess one new piece on metal would be kind of the local reuse and remanufacturing piece. Since it is such a highly recyclable material, it'd be really great to attract statewide reuse or remanufacturing businesses who could kind of collect the metal here and reuse it locally. That's always the goal, I guess, but with metal, that seems more like there might be more opportunity than some of the other materials, just because it is so easy to melt it down and recycle it, and it's not very toxic. So glass is a problem child nationwide. So not much glass is getting recycled either. Much more of it is getting landfilled. Glass is a small percentage of our waste stream, but a even smaller percentage of that is being recycled. Again, it's similar to metals, where it's very energy and resource intensive to create, but it's inert once it goes into the landfill. But it is another material that can be recycled forever. But the problem is there are very few markets for glass recycling in the US. There are many municipalities that accept glass for recycling, but they're not actually doing what we think of when we think of recycling glass. For example, Denver, Colorado accepts glass in their single stream recycling bin, but then it gets sorted out and sent to the landfill where they crush it up and use it as drainage. So it is getting another use, but it's not getting that kind of traditional recycling reuse option that we think of when we might throw our glass in the bin. Here in Missoula, we have Recycling Works that hosts a quarterly glass recycling event. They also offer residential pickup for $10 a month. You can do a 5-gallon bucket of glass. And so they collect that and they put it on trucks that go to Salt Lake City, Utah, where that glass gets reused in fiberglass and those sorts of materials. And so there aren't really any good local markets that we know of in Montana or in our region for glass. And so that's kind of the best option that Recycling Works has found. It seems like a good solution for now, just because we have tried in Missoula different things. Like at one point they were collecting it to try to grind it up and use it as road base. That failed because they couldn't quite get the specs they needed to get approval to use it on our highways and roadways and that sort of thing. And Other things have been tried to keep it local. I think we had a partnership with Target at one point where Target would take the glass and send it to wherever they were sending it, but it got too big too soon and there was too much contamination, so they kind of shut it off immediately. So this is something that people, if they want to participate, they have to pay for it. At the recycling events, it's $1 a gallon to recycle. And even though it's being sent to Salt Lake City, Utah, the Recycling Works tries really hard to find trucks that would otherwise be going to Salt Lake City empty and put it on those trucks. And so I guess it's kind of a wash. We would love to explore different opportunities for recycled glass as road-based, because that is a successful model in other municipalities and other areas. And this is kind of another material where we'd really like to promote reuse. We have a cool reuse program here from Bayer Brewery, and they sell their beer bottles and then they accept their beer bottles back. So you can buy a 6-pack from them and bring it back, and they have this really cool conveyor belt system that actually is very prominent in their brewery, where they're washing the bottles and able to reuse them. And it's really cool. I think breweries from other towns and other states send their bottles to Bayern as well. And so we'd love to see more of that kind of creative reuse come out of some of these programs. So again, we want to just encourage more reuse of glass rather than recycling. Okay, we're getting close to the end, so bear with me. Household hazardous waste is a very small percentage of our total waste stream, but it is very toxic and dangerous for residents to store. In Missoula, we have a yearly collection event for household hazardous waste, and we're also looking at doing a pilot permanent location in the city to collect household hazardous waste. And I'm going to specify household hazardous waste because that's a very different classification than any other type of hazardous waste. And so on the state level, in terms of oversight, there's very little oversight on materials if it's considered household hazardous waste. And so we could pretty easily do kind of a pilot storage program rather than that yearly collection event, because it gets overrun on a yearly basis where they're just too overstretched. And so we're trying to figure out a different solution. But one of the things that we would really love to focus on is that education piece with household hazardous waste, because you don't have to use a lot of the materials that we use. There are lots of natural and less toxic alternatives. And so we'd really love to help promote those sorts of things. And we also are hoping that with a permanent site, we might be able to put aside and promote reuse or sharing or reselling of materials rather than just collecting everything in a frenzy and sending it off. One of the problems is that when we say we're recycling household hazardous waste, we're really just sending it somewhere where it's going to get landfilled in a special hazardous waste landfill, or it's going to get incinerated at some point. It's not really being recycled. And then the catch-all, kind of the last thing, is the hard to recycle materials. So these are things like electronics, books, I already said electronics, big kind of plastics, yoga mats, any sort of catch-all that doesn't fit in this traditional recycling bin. It's difficult to kind of quantify this category, but we kind of estimate that other piece to be between 16 and 28% of the materials going to the landfill. A big piece of this is the end market piece. You need an end market in order to collect these materials. You can't just collect them and hope that there'll be something to do with them. A good example of that is mattresses. So there's a lot of different municipalities that have mattress recycling. We talked to somebody that runs one in Denver, Colorado, and he estimated that you need about 1 million people in your municipality in order to make it economically viable to collect mattresses. Not only that, but the end market for the different pieces of mattresses are dying. For example, a lot of the cotton batting goes to the carpet industry, but carpet is less and less popular. And so actually the carpet industry itself is fading away. And so pretty soon there won't be any end market for that cotton batting. And so it's a really hard thing to do when you're looking at these sorts of materials, because you don't want to create a whole new collection program and then stockpile things because there's no end market for that. One good example of that is asphalt shingles. Asphalt shingles at one point were really promising to be used as road base, like I mentioned, in the glass category. And so lots of municipalities started saying, bring your asphalt shingles, and they would create mountains of them. And then that market dried up almost overnight. And then municipalities were left with these huge, huge piles of asphalt shingles. And that's kind of a worst case scenario. I know that you have some electronics recycling in Helena, and that's great. The electronic story is a good one in terms of being careful about end markets, because there are a lot of electronics companies that are unethically recycling their materials, where they're just bailing them up and sending them to China or other faraway places where child labor issues and lax air and water quality issues kind of wreak havoc on the local communities. And so specific to electronics, when they're sent to some of these other countries, the only pieces that are valuable are the little metal pieces. And so they use kids or whoever to climb the mountains of electronics and pull the little pieces out, and then they end up burning the rest of it. And so that's a really bad example of things we don't want to be happening to our electronics. And so there are all kinds of certification programs to make sure that electronics are recycled in a responsible manner. Here locally, we have an electronic company that accepts for recycling. They're collected, stored, and then sent to Seattle for processing. And our local electric company does not have the certification, but they make sure that the Seattle company they send it to has that. It's called the eSteward certification. One, I guess, big opportunity we have here is we've started hosting Fix-It clinics here in Missoula. We've moved that to a virtual platform during the pandemic, but it was in person, where we would have volunteers come and help. People could bring in a toaster or a vacuum cleaner or a clock or something and have it repaired by a volunteer handyman or something. And so we'd really like to continue to encourage reuse over and repair over throwing those materials away or even finding recycling markets for them. We had an idea that would be really cool if there was a permanent Fix-It location where you have volunteers or a couple staff members or something, and at any time people could bring their materials in and have the tools and support that they need to repair their materials. So this is another kind of big overview that I'll just pause on for a second. We're getting kind of close to the end of the presentation, but these are just some of the things that we see as being opportunities for each of these materials. And I'm happy for this to go out to people after this presentation if you want to, and that way I know I'm moving through it very quickly and not giving you really enough time to read, but hopefully I covered a lot of these things. So again, just to revisit, this is what we're working off of, is this very crude look at this is what it would take to require Zero Waste Missoula. So educated citizens, again, policy and incentives, infrastructure and end markets, and then circling back around to make sure that all of those pieces are in place continuously. So some key takeaways from this presentation, specifically to Missoula, we have a goal of zero waste by 2050, but we have no idea where we're at because we don't require any sort of data collection. And so we think that the city of Missoula should require haulers to report data in order to assess our current status and progress towards goals. We have pretty good options in terms of recycling and composting infrastructure. So local remanufacturing would enable materials to stay with our local economy, but this is a long way off due to the lack of end markets and low populations and those sorts of things. So like, for example, the mattress that I talked about before, our population in the city of Missoula and probably even statewide is just too low to make something like mattress recycling economically viable in order to bring in new business. We really want to support new local businesses without the need for government subsidies and those sorts of things. And there are some things that are just not possible now. And it's just kind of hard to do that. So we are focusing on recycling and composting. But across the materials, there's a need for local policy. Planning regulation is a big one that I didn't really bring up before, but as we have all of this new construction happening in the city, it's really important to plan for zero waste as these new developments are happening. And so, for example, there's a project called the Mullen Road Project where they're building, I think, 180 new homes, and it's going to be kind of a work, live, play community where they're going to build businesses and all those sorts of things. And we're recommending to them to make sure that they build in zero waste infrastructure. So something as simple as dumpster enclosures that can handle not only landfill dumpsters, but also compost and recycling dumpsters as well. And so a lot of that just gets overlooked a lot, where, you know, they'll build a parking lot and they'll just have this tiny little enclosure for the trash, and they don't think to do it bigger. And then you kind of have to work backwards and figure out how to fit those things in, where if it were planned into the new development, that makes it much easier. Another kind of planning piece is that anytime they put a new trash bin, they should also put in an opportunity to compost and recycle. Incentives are a big one. You know, they're always funding, dependent on funding availability. Opportunities to reduce and reuse, and then the infrastructure piece as the end goal. So we kind of want to put a lot of these things in place before we're asking the city to invest in a local materials recovery facility or a construction sorting facility or something like that. We need to make sure that we're set up well so that it will be a successful investment. For our community specifically, reduce and reuse are keys to zero waste. Given that in Montana, we are pretty isolated from a lot of these big end market opportunities, we really want to encourage our residents to reduce and reuse over diverting their materials. This one's kind of specific to our infrastructure task force because they were just looking at infrastructure, but we're asking them to kind of expand that to look at the different pieces that would make the infrastructure successful, like I just said, like the policy piece and the education piece and those sorts of things. So we're really growing our task force. They had no idea what we were going to be asking from them, and now we're kind of asking them to be advising on a lot more than they thought they were signing up for, but luckily they're game for it. So this is kind of the thing that we're going to focus on in the next year to 3 years. For Missoula. And this is really what I was getting at this whole presentation, is that I really wanted to share with you that these are the things that we are really going to put some energy behind in the next few years. And hopefully there's some opportunity for collaboration or sharing of best practices and those sorts of things. But the first one is the one that I just talked about, is that new requiring infrastructure in new builds, and then adding zero waste infrastructure in existing locations. For example, not many of our ballparks have a recycling bin. And so kids are, you know, in a normal year, kids are playing baseball, they're drinking lots of Gatorade or things in cans, and then they're just having to throw it away because there isn't even a recycling bin. So looking at existing, but also new infrastructure piece opportunities. Potential for a data requirement is a hauler ordinance. And so that's usually tied to a municipality's permitting of a hauler would be just the requirement that they report data once a year. And so again, we don't know if that's legal in terms of local rule, but we're hoping that we can do something to ensure that we get more data, because that's just a real problem here. We have lots of opportunities that we're working on to increase deconstruction. As I mentioned, there was that whole chart. We are interested in trying to find funding for creation of a local zero waste grant program. So what this would look like is if somebody wanted to start a business in town and they needed a little bit of capital, as long as their business was related to zero waste, we could kind of help fund a piece of their project. So for example, I mentioned that there was this organization called Soil Cycle in town who wants to create neighborhood compost pickup. And so they just need a pickup truck. In order to make this happen, they just need to buy a pickup truck. And that seems like a really small ask, and hopefully they can find funding for it. But that would be the type of program that would be really cool, to kind of have a pot of money set aside, like $50,000 or something, where you could just push out like $10,000 grants here and there to help support. pay as you throw, I talked a little bit about, would be great. Again, I don't know the legality of it here in Montana, if a local municipality can pass something like pay as you throw policy. And then potentially, as I mentioned, a repair facility here in Missoula. So I think that is it for what I had to share.
Well, that's a lot. Really great information, Lee. And for those who are on this, we'll be sure to get your PowerPoint and share it with folks, as well as others we've invited who weren't able to attend, because it was great. And I love not having to take notes, because we're going to be getting a copy of your presentation. So thank you so much again for putting that all together. So I'm going to go down the list of questions on the chat, not in any order of priority, just by order of appearance. So someone asked, how much would it cost the city of Missoula to start a curbside organic waste collection service?
Okay, so we have curbside organic collection opportunities. So somebody can pay in. We have 2 haulers, I believe, maybe 3 haulers who are just private, really small operations that do offer, I think it's between $10 and $20 a month for you to get residential curbside compost pickup. It is like a small bucket or something. It really requires an extra effort, and it doesn't align with the trash and recycling pickup. Currently, Republic Services, who does have kind of the monopoly in Missoula to pick up curbside trash, does not offer residential curbside compost. They do offer it to businesses. So it would really kind of be up to them to add that program. And I do think it would probably be pretty significant in terms of buying all the carts that they would have to buy, doing the marketing and those sorts of things. And then they don't own the compost facility. And so their charging of that service would have to kind of reimburse them for all of those costs, and then the cost of actually paying to dump it at the municipally owned facility. Our municipality does not own any sort of hauling service. So it would just always happen in the private sector as of now.
Denise, we should add here that, and I don't know who TCL, I don't know who TCL is, but who asked the question, but in Helena, 406 Recycling, and there is someone here from 406 Recycling, does offer curbside recycling. You can subscribe for $28 a month for a 5-gallon bucket, and it's picked up every 2 weeks.
Oh, and actually, so my name is Chelsea and I'm with the company. It's so for $20 a month and then $5 for each additional bucket. And we pick up the buckets every other week, and they are 5-gallon buckets. And we've actually just started working with some businesses. And so we're really excited for that. So yeah, there's a lot of demand for it.
Awesome, that's great.
It's a great program.
Yeah.
I participate. Next question is, does Missoula have a pay-as-you-throw program or considered it? Or are you up against the whole Republic Services?
It is a tough one. It is on our list to explore the legality of it, but it would for sure be kind of an uphill battle in terms of partnerships and those sorts of things. Because currently there are, like I mentioned, there's Missoula Compost Collection and there's Soil Cycle, and they're kind of these homegrown grassroots organizations that collect compost. And so if we were requiring that people pay for trash but not compost or recycling, it would be hard to figure out how to work all of those things together so that we don't put the little guys out of business. That would be the last thing we would want to do. And so it feels like pay as you throw is a long way away, but we don't want to drop it from the conversation, because I think that the ideology that people are paying to throw away their trash, but they're not paying to compost or recycle is a really good model. And so if we can figure out a way to do that, we want to.
Do you know any cities that do have pay as you throw?
Yeah, some of the bigger, so I think Seattle and Portland, I know Boulder had it, Denver has it. some of the bigger municipalities, and generally it is, no, that's not true. It's kind of all over the place in terms of if it's a municipally run hauling service or not. It can work in the private sector as well.
Somebody does note here, Chelsea with 406 Recycling does note that New Zealand has a really successful pay-as-you-throw program. So to the extent that we're looking at, you know, other locations that have done so successfully to model from, that's a good thing to think about. I was wondering about I understand Republic Services owns the waste hauling and disposal, the landfill. But I'm wondering if you've thought about what leverage you have with you being the public and the city of Missoula with enacting, putting certain requirements into their contract. So we will contract with you to haul away our waste and dispose of it if you do this, that, or the other thing.
Yeah, so I think the only contractual obligations that Republic is under and with the city is that they pick up city waste, and so the city pays them to pick up their waste. And I think that there's some leverage they could have there, but the only reason that Republic is our only hauler is because Republic's our only hauler. There isn't any sort of, we don't have a contractual agreement with them that they are the only hauler in the municipality of Missoula. It's just that nobody else has come along to challenge that.
Okay, I thought so. Okay, let's see. Does Republic offer, oh, this is my question. Does Republic offer curbside recycling? And if so, is it single stream or source separated?
Yeah, they do offer curbside recycling for an additional fee, and it is largely single stream on the residential sector. In the commercial sector, they have been asking some businesses to sort out some of the more valuable materials. So right now, cardboard and aluminum is very valuable. And so if a business creates enough volume, they'll provide separate dumpsters for compost or aluminum cans. So some of the schools, I think, are creating a lot of aluminum can waste. And so Republic will actually even offer a better rate for their recycling if they're willing to source separate.
Do you know what Republic does with the collected single stream recyclables?
They just, so they have a transfer station here, and so that all just gets crunched together and baled up and then sent out to their larger sorting facility in Tacoma, Washington.
Okay.
And then that's where it kind of goes through all of those processes of getting separated.
Right. So Ann Brodsky asks if there's anything going on nationally to reduce plastic use. So one of the things we're all seeing, I believe, you go into the grocery store and it's getting harder and harder actually to buy produce that's not wrapped in plastic. So is there anything that you know of? Go ahead, Ann.
Oh, no, it just makes me so mad.
I know. Yeah, that's awful.
Yeah, there are some plastic reduction things happening on the national level. They don't tend to go too far, unfortunately. I do think this would be a situation where we have a lot of power as consumers, but unfortunately, Anne is right in that sometimes you don't even have the opportunity. Like, I'm so embarrassed. I've been doing this for 12 years and I tried to go 1 week plastic free. And I came home from the grocery store with a big tub of cherry tomatoes. And like, I didn't even make the connection because it's just, you can't get cherry tomatoes without getting plastic. And so it's really frustrating. Plastic packaging is an issue, and it's, yeah, there's hasn't been anything successful. I think California just did something around bottles where their plastic disposable bottles have to have a certain amount of recycled content in it. I think it ramps up to, at a certain year, it has to be a 50% recycled content plastic bottle. So that's one model. We in Montana, unfortunately, are going the other way. I don't know if you heard about that. takeaway packaging bill that just failed or passed, I guess.
It passed, yeah.
Yeah.
It's on the way to passing. It's very close.
Yeah, unfortunately. So that really takes away a lot of opportunity to reduce that single-use plastic usage.
It does in terms of, from what I read, and I did not read it extensively, but from what I understand, it's more like it prevents local governments from like enacting bans, right? And ordinances, etc. But I don't know that that translates to, local efforts to work with the various stores to figure out something different. Like we could still do that, but I don't think like the city of Helena, for example, now can ban, I don't know what we hadn't talked about bans, but various type of container bans, which is, so much
bottle bill. You can't enact a bottle bill.
Yeah,
but no, I don't think
so much for local control. Thank you very much.
Yeah, yeah. And it's tough. Plastic in supermarket use is a tough issue because, it's always kind of on the tip of my tongue to say, well, just buy local. But that's, doesn't really look at things from a social justice lens. It looks at things from a very entitled lens of, purchase from your local CSA and you won't get any plastic, but that's not available to everybody. And so I do think it's really important to focus on solutions that would affect the larger populations and
Right. Okay, so TCL asks, I did, by the way, I volunteered to travel to New Zealand, for the betterment of the effort, to both look at their Food in the Nude project and some other thing New Zealand did that's great. So, if there's a grant for that, I'll do it.
That's so nice of you, Denise.
I know. I'll just sacrifice. It's so important to me. Okay, let's see. Where are we? TCL. Would a quarterly household hazardous waste collection event work? And to that, I think, and Pete's on the call, so he could help. I believe we do an event. I just can't remember if it's quarterly or annually or.
Denise, can you hear me?
I can.
The city of Helena does an annual event, and
Okay.
It's basically what Lee was talking about with Missoula. We contract with the household hazardous waste company to come in, and they package it and get it ready for shipping. Most of it goes to a household hazardous waste landfill, and some of it is actually diverted and reused.
Great.
Awesome, that's great. And I don't know what kind of staffing you have or how expensive it is, but our yearly collection here is just really overstresses our staff, our limited staff that we have it's I think run through our wastewater treatment folks, and it costs a lot of money, an incredible amount of money to kind of bring in the recyclers for the day or the people who transport it to wherever it's going. And so I don't know that our city would be open. It's kind of either at this point, either a yearly collection or some sort of pilot permanent collection station.
Well, and Pete, in Helena, can't we drop off household hazardous waste out at the transfer station anytime as well? I can't remember. There's an area before you get to the glass and plastics and all that. Is that
we only have we accept antifreeze, oil, and batteries and stuff like that on an everyday use, but the other household hazardous waste is a once a year, just as Lee stated. It costs us about $30,000 to put on that annual event once a year.
Wow. That's a lot of money.
Yeah, thanks, Pete.
Okay, so just trying to wrap up, see what questions kind of haven't touched anything. is there, Cora Helm asks, are there incentives for businesses in Missoula to use compostable packaging for food products so as to reduce the contamination at the compost facility?
We don't. We are working on a business program to educate and I guess incentivize through a business recognition program. And so we haven't figured out kind of a monetary incentive system. And I saw above TCL said that incentive seems really broad, and you're right, because it could be anything from like I said, a monetary incentive. It could be some sort of community incentive, some sort of broad recognition, or it could be, I don't know. It is a very broad term because it could mean any way that we can really encourage people to do the thing that we're asking them to do, and whatever motivates them. For example, with the deconstruction piece, we've had a lot of contractors say, well, if you make the permitting process easier and quicker, we would be more inclined to deconstruct. And so they're not asking for funding, they're asking for an easier permitting process. The compostable packaging issue is an interesting one. We actually don't have a problem with those materials here at our compost facility, according to the people who are processing those. But a lot of, and I can send this to you to share, but there was a really great webinar last week around the problem with compostable packaging. There's so many problems with compostable packaging. First, in how it's made. It's made with GMO corn that's grown here in the US. And then that corn is sent over to China generally to make the resin for the compostable packaging. And then it's sent back to the US to be made into whatever packaging it's going to. And so that's a whole host of issues on its own. But then a lot of those materials don't break down normally in a compost facility. And so while it is a solution, it is not, I don't think, the solution. And so that's a tough one. But yeah, and with COVID and everything, I mean, for a long time, we were really trying to encourage and educate around the reuse piece, as we all, I think, have been doing for a long time, is bring your own cup, bring your own mug, bring your own takeout container, whatever it is. But that's kind of come to a big halt. And so there are a lot of restaurants here that do use compostable packaging for food products, but don't have a lot of people who are actually composting in our city yet. And so you might get your compostable package, but you're probably going to put it in the landfill if you're a Missoula resident. And that's a problem, because as those materials break down, they create more methane than a plastic coated package would. So I don't mean to sound too negative on compostable packaging, but it's definitely something that we're not focused on as an end solution. It's more of like a on the road sort of solution.
Lee, is it true that compostable packaging doesn't break down in like backyard composting bins? It needs to be in a commercial facility. Is that true?
Yeah, it is true. Our backyard bins don't get hot enough. And so if you put one of those compostable cups in, it'll shrink in the sun, but then it probably won't ever break down. And then the utensils are tough too.
I think that's a great example, though, of how we have to be careful that our solutions, aren't bigger than the problems that they're trying to resolve. And I think part of this is a learning process, and we try and explore and we do certain things, but we're in this for the long haul. And it's important to just understand the full picture before we know whether or not a given route is the best one to take, even if initially it looks like, well, we won, we just removed that from the landfill. But I appreciate, Lee, your knowledge of and commitment to things beyond reducing the landfill. Like, who knew that child labor was being used to climb up a mountain of electronics? I mean, that's horrible. I mean, talk about an incentive to not produce this waste in the first place. So anyway, I think that those are good examples of just, be careful and be smart about the whole picture. Is there any other question on here that I haven't? So we have, I will say one thing that we have promoted on here, the 406 compost program, because it's awesome. So I also want to take a minute to promote John Hilton's Curbside recycling program. That's awesome too, because it's it's source separated recycling, which I am a big fan of. I will remain a major opponent of single stream recycling, which I believe the city is moving. If it's going to do something, it's looking at that pretty heavily, and I would like to try and push that ship in a different direction. So I just want to say shout out to John and his company for source separated recycling that's affordable, that the city helps out through a subsidy. And if people on this call haven't done it, I encourage you to look into it and encourage others to promote that business as well. So
Denise,
I appreciate it, Denise. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I wonder if we might just open it up to questions, have people unmute. And then Lee, and while people are thinking about that, Lee, could you talk a little bit about the waste audit that Missoula recently conducted and how the process you went about in conducting the waste audit and your findings so far?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was kind of explaining before the call started that it hasn't been officially released yet for a number of reasons, but it is on our website. And I think that there's a link a couple times in the chat. So we had a waste baseline study that the city and Republic Services actually partnered on, and they each put in, I think, $10,000 for the project. And so unfortunately, $20,000 seems like a lot of money, but it was not enough to have a consultant come and do an actual waste audit for the city of Missoula. So kind of the next best option was to hire a consultant who's done a lot of waste audits. And they kind of used that data along with data that Republic was willing to share to make some assumptions about what our waste stream would look like in the city of Missoula. And so it's not as robust as I would like. There's not a ton of confidence behind it because it's not actual data for us. And there were some assumptions made maybe that are a stretch. And so, yeah, take a look at it. There are some good recommendations that really aligned well with what I said at the end of this presentation. So that was really great. And the biggest takeaway is that we don't have data and we need data. So we have to figure out how to get good data so that we can have better reports done in the future. But I would say if you're looking at doing a waste audit or a waste baseline study, make sure that you find a way to get between $50,000 and $70,000 to get a real, that's kind of the going rate for a real waste audit.
So I have a comment / question about that. Certainly, data, we need data to know what we're doing, how well we're doing it, what we need to continue doing more of. But I would think that the key data point that's needed for any kind of a waste reduction program is how much is being sent to the landfill now. And then as the waste reduction program advances, how much, measuring the amount of waste that is being generated over time, because that to me is the key data point. 100 tons, now 50 tons, now we have a 50% reduction. And I also feel like we know from the national studies, like the EPA charts, we have a pretty good idea, generally speaking, of what's going into landfills. We already know the low-hanging fruit, for example, which is organic waste and paper products. If our committee focused just on that, we'd meet our goal without having to know right now what is going specifically into our landfill. So I just would, I don't know, I guess I would like to ask you to address that. What does a actual waste audit get you that we kind of don't already have through some general statistics?
And then just to focus that in Helena and Lewis and Clark County, because it's a joint city county landfill, they're publicly operated. Our transfer station, our solid waste pickup, and landfill publicly operated. So different issues, and hopefully we're getting out of COVID too. So that may make a different issue too.
Yeah, so I think those are all good points. And the reason I wanted to show you that national snapshot versus the Boulder County snapshot is because they are very similar. And so, yeah, I don't know that it is necessarily at this point, since so many communities have done that, and we can generally say like 20% of the material is paper and 40% is going to be organic material and those sorts of things. But I think you're right, is to measure success, you want to know what does it look like now? And then after some effort, what does that look like? But I think the biggest piece is the diversion piece too. Because by measuring how much is in the landfill now and then how much is in the landfill in 10 years or so, you can really see how much reduction effort you've had. But also it's important to know what materials are being diverted from the landfill as well. And so looking specifically at the weights of the compost, at the weight of the recycling, and seeing how those things change over time as well. And that can kind of assess how well your community is doing at reducing the materials, because that's really the overall goal, is to just stop using so much stuff. And then also to recycle and compost. But some studies have gotten really robust. They'll include things like thrift stores and like the ReStore, and to really look at every opportunity that someone could throw away something and then decides not to, and where does that material go. So yeah, I think
so
that
where
data,
do you get the diversion rate, the diversion rate information? Because you wouldn't get that out of a waste audit, because the diversion rate is like how much went to the recycling facility and how much was composted, like you said. But that wouldn't be part of a waste audit, or would it?
it would. So generally, instead of waste audit, they're now called waste characterization studies. And so it would, for kind of maybe that higher tier cost, they would look at the snapshot of what's going to the landfill, what's going into the compost and the recycling, and then could even potentially look at those other diversion opportunities too, and then give you a very specific number of where you're at volume wise, and then also where you're at percentage wise diverting your materials. And then we called it the baseline study, knowing that we really wouldn't get all of that material. We really were hoping that they would give us some idea of where we're at currently, but we didn't get that in our study. And so yeah, I think the biggest thing is to kind of get that baseline data and then be able to compare it after you've done whatever efforts you implement.
So it sounds to me, and I'm just cutting my teeth on this, that it's less about collecting data on what's being thrown away. It includes that for sure, but a waste characterization study would also, a one that's worth the money that's spent on it, would also reveal how much is actually being diverted from the landfill. So it's beyond just, I kept thinking a waste audit was simply that, like, what's being put into the landfill. And I was always like, whatever. Because we kind of already, because we already know. So I was like, what's the value of that in terms of getting specifics? But if it's more of, and I would think that even without a study, we could survey the various entities that are diverting the waste. So we can go to John Hilton, we can go to 406 Recycling, we could go to the city and just add up numbers of how much waste did you know what I mean? So it seems like that information could be available already if we don't find $60-some thousand for a waste audit.
Absolutely, yeah. It's just a matter of if you have entities who are tracking data. What we found is that our entities are not. And so our first opportunity is to ask them to, and then ask them to do it voluntarily. And if they won't do that, then we would have to kind of go the mandatory route. But you're right. If that data exists and there's somebody who's willing to put in the effort to collect it and put it all together, it's a very easy calculation to figure out. So
We just as an information, we keep track of that already for the city operations. So the city operations in terms of what's the tonnage that's of the different types of commodities that are being recycled, we keep track of that. And then we've Pat Judge, who's very successfully trying to remain silent here. He's my go-to guy. Well, and Pete Anderson, from the solid waste. But we've, we've been working with general numbers because we know we don't have everything. We don't have everything that goes into the landfill, but we don't have everything that gets diverted either, like the ReStore and other private businesses and so forth. So.
Yeah, and so Pete, I will, I guess, put you on the spot and ask if the waste audit is still, if the solid waste department or public works department is still proposing to include funding for a waste audit in this next year's budget.
Diane, we are budgeting for the master plan. I do not know all the different components of that plan, but there is budgeting going on for a master plan with the city of Helena and Lewis and Clark County.
Okay. Well, thanks. Maybe we can follow up with that and see, get more detail. Thanks.
Well, it is 8:30, so I think we should probably wrap up, but maybe Lee, if you would be interested in putting your contact information in the chat box, like your email or something, so if people want to, get in touch with you, I'm sure we could just look you up too, like Lee Ratterman, Missoula Home Restore or ReSource. So if people have additional questions, but thank you so very much for giving us your Monday night and sharing all the work you guys are doing. We're so thrilled you're doing it. So that we have somebody to follow. And is there anything else we want to wrap up with, Diana or Ann?
No, I just wanted to add that if any of the participants here have particular areas that they would like to spend time working on in the next coming months or even year, we want to hear from you. I put down at the very beginning, I know I'm pretty interested in working on educational piece, but I don't want to do it alone. So if anyone's interested in helping, let me know. And any other subjects. I mean, there's a million subjects of things that could be done. Working with schools, working with students, working with schools administration, working with, I mean, there's just a million things. Private businesses.
All right, and then I would just say this recording will be we'll share, Ann and Denise will share it with this group, but it will also be posted on the Resilient Helena website under events.
Wonderful.
Thanks again, everyone, for attending.
And thank you, Resilient Helena, for hosting yet again.
Yeah, thanks for everyone attending, and thank you so much, Lee.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for letting me talk at you for an hour.
It's a lot of great information, yeah.
Lots. All right, I think we'll end. So thanks, everyone, and we'll be in touch.